Fiscal policy has an inherent, two inherent limits. One is that there's a time lag on the impact of this kind of policy. So if the government is going to try to stimulate the economy by building bridges and hiring people to do that, it takes a while for that to result in economic growth. The same thing with relying upon investors. It takes a while for that to translate into economic growth. Another kind of inflexibility comes from the budget. The way that our federal budget is structured right now, most of the federal budget is mandatory expenditures. Let me just show you these pie charts that are in your textbook. This is the entire federal budget, 1962 and 2013. And federal expenditures are either discretionary or mandatory or net interest on the national debt. Discretionary expenditures are expenditures that can be cut in the normal budget cycle. It does not mean that it's discretionary slush fund or anything like that. That's not what discretionary means. It means it can be cut or in the regular budget cycle. Mandatory expenditures are expenditures that cannot be cut without a change in the underlying law that provides for those expenditures. And you can see that over time this has increased pretty dramatically, mandatory expenditures as a part of the federal budget. Now the big difference between 62 and 87 is that 65 is when Medicare and Medicaid are passed, and those are two of the biggest categories of mandatory expenditures at this time. And so let me show you in a little bit more detail how that looks. Let me take you to a nice little chart that was in the New York Times in 2012, and it breaks up the federal budget. Now, unfortunately, you can't see all of this because this ends here. There's about a few other, a square about this big of other kinds of expenditures. This is the entire federal budget and all the different areas in which money is spent. It's a really nice little chart. I wish they would do this every single year. And in this image, the only thing that shows up is discretionary expenditures. So these are things that can be cut. Wait, is that right? Hold on. Discretionary spending. No, I had it backwards. So the only things that are lit up right now, these are discretionary expenditures. And the largest area of discretionary expenditures is at the Defense Department. And you can see that the rest of it are fairly little tiny chunks of different things that happen. Let me highlight mandatory expenditures. This is Health and Human Services. You can see Medicare and Medicaid. So, for example, Grandma is entitled to have her hip replacement surgery paid for by Medicare under the current law. We don't have any choice about saying, well, sorry, Grandma, we ran out of money. You can't have it funded this year. Unless you change the underlying law to say that she's not entitled to that money, we have to pay it. Same thing with Social Security, and the other major category is the interest on the national debt. That's also mandatory. There are some categories of food and nutrition programs and unemployment insurance that are also mandatory. Most of the other departments are mostly discretionary. So just to give you an example of how that looks. Now, so there is some inflexibility. The other thing to talk about with regard to fiscal policy is what this means for redistribution of income. So when we're talking about taxes, we are inherently discussing how income should be distributed, because we're talking about taking people's income away and using it for other purposes. And so we have to discuss how do these debates sound. Before we can do that, I want to talk about different types of taxes and kind of clarify some of this language first. I'm going to talk about regressive taxes first. Now, regressive taxes are taxes in which one pays a higher effective tax rate the lower one's income. An example of this is Social Security. Now, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example of how Social Security tax works. The actual numbers are very close to this. It's something like, the rates are something like between 0 and 108,000 and 6.2%, and above 108,000 and 0%. But that's harder to work with, so I'm just going to round it off to 100,000 and 6%. So let's assume that Social Security tax is paid on income between 0 and 100,000, 6% of that is taxed, and then above 100,000 the tax rate is 0. So if your income is $100,000, that's within this range, and so you get taxed at 6%, so 100,000 times 6% is $6,000. But let's assume that your income is $1 million. If your income is $1 million, then you have to break your income into chunks. One chunk, $100,000, is taxed at 6%, and that's $6,000. But the rest of it, all of it that's above $100,000, another $900,000, is taxed at 0%. And so the tax there is $0. So if you make $1 million, your total Social Security tax is $6,000. So the effective tax rate on the entire income, if you take $6,000 and divide that into $1 million, you get 0.6%, right? So your effective tax rate of 0.6% is a lot lower than the tax of 6% if your income is $100,000. Okay? Now let's look at how progressive taxes work. So a progressive tax is one in which you have a higher effective tax rate the higher one's income. Now, the federal income tax is an example of this, and the federal income tax uses a marginal tax rate system, okay? And I'm going to again use a hypothetical tax rate set of tax rates. It's quite a bit more complicated than this, but just to show you how this works, let's assume that the taxes are from $0 to $50,000 of income, the tax is 10%, and above $50,000 of income, the tax is 15%, okay? So if your income is $60,000, what you have to do to figure out what your income tax is break your income into chunks again. So the first chunk is the stuff that's below $50,000. So $50,000 times 10%, and that's $5,000. But you still have another $10,000 of income, and that $10,000, because it's above 50, is taxed at 15%. And so the tax there is $1,500, a total tax of $6,500. So your effective tax rate on your entire income is 10.8%, and that's higher than your income if it's $50,000, right? So your tax rate is 10.8%. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you thought that the way that you would calculate the tax on $60,000 is to simply take 60,000 times 15%. That's not the way it works, and I think a lot of people think that it is the way that it works, and so there's a lot of confusion about the effective tax rates of people in the wealthier categories of income. I mean, the reason that we don't do it that way, where you would start taxing the entire thing at 15%, is because it doesn't really make very much sense. So let's say that you make $50,000 right now, so your tax is 10% on your entire income, and then your boss calls you in and says, I'm going to give you a raise of $500, right? So you make $50,500. That's above $50,000, so you tax the whole thing at 15%. Well, suddenly, your entire raise is wiped away, and in fact, you actually pay more tax. You lose money on that salary increase. So that doesn't make any sense. And I've had students before who've told me, oh man, my friend just turned down a raise because he said he was going to be in the next tax bracket and he didn't want to pay more taxes, but that doesn't make any sense because that's not the way it works, right? So we tax the higher marginal tax rate only kicks in on the portion of your income that's above the last tax rate. That's what a marginal tax rate system is. So the effective tax rate, again, is calculated by taking the tax that you end up with and dividing it into your entire income. Okay. Now, I would like for you to know how to calculate marginal tax rate, not the effective tax, a little more difficult, but make sure that you understand how this works. Okay. All right, so going back to this slide then, now that we understand these different types of taxes, we have this debate about how should the tax burden be distributed. And there are three types of debates, three ways to ask this question. One question is, what's fair? Who should justly or fairly pay more taxes? Is it fair to tax people at a higher rate just because their income is higher? So, for instance, with our progressive taxes in the income tax system, in 2014, the top 5% of taxpayers paid 64% of all the federal income taxes. But that's partly because they took home almost 30% of all the income because we have such a high level of income inequality right now. So the top 5% kicks in at about $261,000 a year. That's about 16 million people in the country. And they too pay a higher marginal income tax than the rest do. And let me just show you how, let me just show you real fast the actual tax rates. I forgot to do this. Let me get rid of this language right here. Sorry. Okay. This is the current tax. This is all of the margins. And so the highest, this was raised in 2000, start with the 2014 or 15 tax year, I forget, 2015 tax year, I think. 39.6% is the highest margin, and that's only on taxable income over $400,000 a year. So if you make $401,000 a year, you only pay 39.6% on $1,000, right? So that's the way the marginal tax rate system works. Now if you go back to, I forgot to mention here, so if you looked at the effective income tax in the last presidential rates, we were all surprised to find that Mitt Romney, who is a millionaire, was paying only 14% of his income in taxes. Obama was paying 26%. Now we know that their income is much higher, and of course, the marginal tax rate system doesn't produce for anybody a total income tax of 39.6%. It only kicks in at that higher level of income. But also, most of Mitt Romney's income came from capital gains, and so the tax rate on that is only 15%. And in this presidential election, of course, we've realized that Trump may have paid zero taxes for many years, but we don't know that for sure. And in the next section, in the next chapter, I'm going to talk about, go over a little bit more clearly how that would be the case. But at any rate, so we do have this debate about who is it fair to tax more? And so on one side of the argument is to say that people that are wealthy, it's not fair that you tax them any more at a higher tax rate than anybody else, that everybody should pay the same amount, and we should have sort of a flat tax system. But on the other side, one could say that, the only reason that some people make so much more than other people do is because they manage to be the ones to set the incomes. And they, don't work any harder than a lot of people do that make very little income. And so it is fair that wealthy people may pay more. But you can use the fairness argument on both sides of the debate. Here's another type of argument, though, different type of argument. Who does it make economic sense to tax more, right? And this brings you to the demand versus supply side approaches that we just talked about. So a demand side approach would say that it makes sense to tax wealthy people more so that government can then turn around and spend the money on things that give middle class people more money to spend, right? Either in providing contracts so that they have jobs, or in providing tax rebates to middle class people, or in making it so that middle class families don't have to pay as much for college, and that frees up money for them to spend on other kinds of things. It increases the economic power of the middle class. So that's the demand side approach. The supply side approach, of course, argues that it makes more sense to tax wealthy people at a lower rate, to allow them to keep their money because they'll take their money and invest it and create jobs. In the presidential debate, the two sides, the two candidates divide on this question. Trump certainly is more in favor of giving very large tax cuts to wealthy people, and his argument is that it's going to increase economic growth, and he's taken a very strictly supply side approach to that. Hillary Clinton has argued that wealthy people should pay higher tax rates. So in her program, for instance, is a tax surcharge on people making more than $5 million a year. I think the tax rate on that would be something like 47% on income above $5 million. And also a minimum income tax of 30% for people for incomes over $1 million, so that someone like Donald Trump wouldn't be able to pay zero income tax. He would have to pay at least 30% of his income over $1 million in tax. So very different, about as starkly different an approach as one could get among these candidates in terms of who does it make economic sense to tax more. But there's a third kind of argument that has to be dealt with, and that's the question about, it's a very pragmatic kind of argument that starts with the number 4 trillion. And that is about how much the federal government spends every year. So however one distributes the tax burden, one needs to collect $4 trillion in revenue. And if you go with the kind of the fairness argument that the wealthy shouldn't pay any higher level of tax than anybody else, it's impossible to get to $4 trillion of revenue if you have a flat tax. And so unless you're going to seriously cut expenditures under a plan like Donald Trump's plan, for instance, you're not going to produce enough revenue to avoid increasing the national debt even farther than it is. And we've already talked about the fact that it's very difficult to seriously cut federal government expenditures. Almost 2/3 of the federal government of the expenditures right now are in those 3 areas of mandatory expenditures that one really can't cut. Now, in the current situation with such a partisan divide among elected officials, this is quite difficult, and they're taking these very starkly different approaches to these questions that really require some kind of a compromise to get these decisions.